Are you seeing mine? Okay,
yep, I see it.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank Brad for that because I think that was really insightful. You can't get enough examples of infill that are appropriate. No matter how many I see, there's not enough for me to ever be prepared for the next thing that's going to hit my desk. It's always a surprise. So that was really helpful. So thank you guys for sticking around to learn a little bit about cemetery preservation. I'm Amanda Burke. I am an architectural historian here at Missouri SHPO and the head of the Review and Compliance and Records section. So if you have any Section 106 projects involving historic structures, then it's probably me that you're working with most of the time. Kelsey has pitched in before when I was out on maternity leave as well as a few other people from our staff, but mostly it's me. So let's talk a little bit first about cemeteries and what they are and what makes them eligible for listing on the National Register. So according to the National Park Service, a cultural landscape is a geographic area associated with a historic event, activity, or person, and it has cultural or aesthetic values. So I think a lot of us understand, what a cemetery is, but not necessarily that it also is a cultural landscape. So thinking about it that way too, and that it fits in with other different types of landscapes that we have. So what kind of cemeteries are eligible for listing in the National Register? Cemeteries can be eligible in multiple ways. They can contribute to a historic district, or they can be a historic district themselves. They can be eligible, so both individually and contributing to a district. They can be eligible under criterion A, B, or C, or D, so kind of all of them. And they usually represent the general history of a community. They might be eligible as part of a historic church or religious institution. They might be eligible because they're the only remnant of a town left, or might be a significant person's burial. But for it to be significant as a person's burial, it has to be the last remaining place associated with that person, so nowhere that they lived or had any sort of active life, whatever they're significant for. If they were a businessman, their business is gone, so no other items are left, so then their gravesite might be important, or they have artistic or architectural or planning significance. So what areas of significance? I'm sure some of you are familiar with the different criteria, but maybe not as they apply to cemeteries. So a lot of times events that are applicable are settlement. Like we said before about a person, it could be eligible as their last resting place with those caveats I mentioned. It could be significant for art and design or architecture, landscape architecture. It could have been designed kind of as a park. A lot of times, in the mid-19th century, it was oftentimes that the public space was kind of also the burying ground, and so it was not uncommon for people to have kind of more sculptural or artistic gravestones to kind of add to that park-like atmosphere. And so you can have significance associated with that. And then you can also have criterion D, which is data. And I'd like to just kind of make a little distinction here. A cemetery with no markers is not an unmarked burial. So a cemetery that is a known cemetery always follows under the cemetery law, and unmarked burials are ones that nobody knew was there prior to the finding of that burial. So, like I said, it's kind of hard for cemeteries to be eligible for listing on the National Register because there are so many cemeteries. Every person is important, but, is it enough to establish significance under the National Register? Just because it may not be National Register eligible doesn't mean that your cemetery isn't an important place and that it doesn't matter. So a lot of us want to protect our cemeteries. Some of us may have cemeteries in our, under our municipality's oversight. We might have cemeteries that we have family members buried at, or maybe even cemeteries on our property. So what are we going to do to protect our cemeteries? We're going to plan. Planning is your number one tool in your toolbox besides general maintenance. So you're going to plan for survey, you're going to plan to do recordation, you're going to plan for maintenance, and plan for conservation. So when you're creating your survey plan, you want to take a lot of things into consideration before you go out into the cemetery and just start surveying things. And some of those items that you want to think about are the history of the area. The customs and culture of the people who use the cemetery are very important, because you don't want to, go out there or do anything in the cemetery that might be offensive to somebody who have family members buried there or who is visiting there. You want to take existing policies, care and conditions into account, and then what's really important is an accurate map. So at the Missouri SHPO, we have some resources to kind of help you out with your survey and recordation. We have two forms. One is a cemetery form and the other one is a marker form. The cemetery form is kind of a general form that, like, at a glance, what condition is the cemetery in? It's kind of an aggregate of, on average, what percentage of things are in this, good condition, what percentage of things are endangered. You can fill out a cemetery form for any cemetery without submitting any marker forms. So if you have a cemetery in your municipality or, one that you'd like to record because you have a family member buried there, or just one that you like, you're welcome to fill out the cemetery form and submit it to me to file it at our office. And the benefit of that is to have a record on our office, so when we have federal projects using federal funds subject to Section 106, then we can take these cemeteries into account and ensure that we know about them and that they are properly considered as part of the project. Because sometimes, especially with our smaller cemeteries that are maybe less visible, it's pretty common for things to become less and less visible, and it might be us to know right up front that we have one. If you would like, we have a marker form. Now, ideally, the marker form is used to catalog every marker in a cemetery, and it goes and records the inscription and the condition that's on there, what issues might be presenting, and has images and drawings related to that marker. And you can submit as many or as few of these as you would like for a cemetery. Like I said, ideally, we'd love to have a marker form for every marker in the cemetery, but we will accept, if you want to just record, say, the significant people there or just one or two people, that's absolutely fine. But you must submit a cemetery form with a marker form. So you don't have to submit a marker form with a cemetery form, but you must submit a cemetery form with a marker form. So what types of markers do we often see? And as you saw, those is actually on the cemetery form to kind of try and make things a little bit more visual and easy for you. Here are some of the different marker types so that you can identify them when you're out in the cemetery. What type of materials do we often see in the cemetery? We really commonly here in Missouri see stone and brick in the cemetery. You may also see concrete and not really know necessarily that it's concrete, because sometimes you have to get really close to notice it's not a stone, and then, or it might have lichens on it, and then it's hard to tell. So we see concrete quite a bit. We see metal, and we'll talk more about metal in just a minute. Ceramics are pretty uncommon, or you see them less frequently. And then you may find wood in the cemetery. However, most of the time in Missouri, wooden markers, which would have been placed kind of as a temporary marker, most of the time those have already gone and have decayed away. So on your metal markers, you might have something that's really obvious that it's metal, like iron or bronze in the cemetery. You might see them used as a plaque. You might see them as the headstone itself, as you see in these two examples. You might also see iron used in fencing and other types of features like planters and, footstones, different things like that in the cemetery. Now, the one that is oftentimes a little surprising for people is when you run into zinc markers. These markers are in fact metal, however, they appear to be marble. So when you walk up to them, they're white like marble, and they kind of look like marble, but you know that something's a little bit strange about them because the, carvings are like super sharp. They haven't, kind of changed with time. It hasn't had any wearing down on it. And then if you go up and kind of give it a little tap, tap, you'll notice that it sounds like metal. And that is because the markers are made out of zinc, and when zinc weathers, it turns white. And so that's why they call it white bronze. And it also holds its shape really, really well. I don't know why they don't still make a lot of markers out of zinc. They're pretty amazing. So when you're out in the cemetery, you're going to notice that there's all kinds of different icons. And we could have a talk just about icons, but let's just touch on it a little bit here. Iconography is used on grave markers, and it often tells you a little bit about the person who is buried there. If you have a sheep or a dove, you might have the grave of a child or somebody who died very young. If you have wheat, it's often a symbol of somebody who was like very knowledgeable, kind of head of the family person, so maybe an older person. You can also tell about how old a person was based on flowers that might be on it. So if you have flowers that are in like a bud shape as opposed to flowers that are in full bloom, a bud would indicate a younger person. A full bloom flower would be somebody in their, their prime, and then one that was starting to wilt would be somebody who is older. So there's all kinds of things you can learn, and if you have interest in that, I highly encourage you to learn more about it. So a big problem in the cemetery is over time, especially with the marble, it will, kind of deteriorate because it's been subject to weathering from wind and rain. Also, you might have trouble reading things because they are covered in growths, different lichens, mosses, things like that. So there's some tips and tricks you can use for figuring out what your headstone says. One that is really minimally invasive or not invasive at all would be to use a mirror. If you take a mirror and let the light reflect onto the stone, sometimes you can kind of play with the shadows and get to see something a little bit better than you might have seen it before because the shadow wasn't really where you needed it to be. Another way that you can do it is by putting clean, plain water on a marker. Sometimes that will kind of either wash away some of the dirt or will kind of make the different growths turn different colors. So, having that on there can help you figure things out. One way that people often do, which is definitely not recommended, is to take a rubbing. And so this is where you take a piece of paper and you put it on the headstone, and then you take a crayon or a pen and you rub it back and forth on the paper to transfer the image carved into the stone onto the paper. And this is not recommended because there's several reasons, but the primary reason is if that stone is not 100% clean. So like if there are any little particles between the paper and the surface of the stone, whether they be organic or, part of the stone, then what happens is it starts to etch away at the stone whenever you rub that that marker or the pen, or crayon back and forth, and then it actually scratches the surface of the stone and creates more places for lichens and moss to grow and dirt to deposit. So it's really not recommended to take rubbings. A really easy way to find out more information is to take a photograph and then to manipulate it with different filters. You know, we all have smartphones in our pockets. So just to be super simple, I just used Microsoft Word because I'm like, oh, what's something that everybody has access, most everybody. So I threw this one in Word and I manipulate it. So there's some things I think that are clearer in the original image and some things that are better in this image. So manipulating an image in different ways can make things come out in different ways. So that is a highly recommended way. There are lots of other ways that people talk about, and if you have any questions about whether something's appropriate or not, I'm always happy to discuss that. So how can you locate unmarked graves? Because like we say, unmarked graves that are known in a cemetery are not unmarked, unknown human burials. So anyway, what are some of the methods that we can use? One of the most popular is GPR, or ground penetrating radar, and that's where you walk different lines in the cemetery and get readings on a computer readout, and they look similar to the one that you have here on the right, and that can tell you a little bit about what's buried under the surface. A lot of times that can show you where burial shafts might be. I can say that in Missouri, with the different rock and different mineral deposits that are in the soil, you might have better results in some places over others. And there's actually a map that the USGS has that can kind of tell you if GPR is a good idea in your area or not. So I recommend looking at that before trying to find a surveyor. Another way that you might be able to find the markers, so this is when, so for the GPR, that would be when you have no known headstones, nothing there, you'd be using the GPR. If you have some headstones that might be buried or fragments of, you might want to do some probing, and this is just with a metal rod. You push it into the ground until you feel resistance, and then you go ahead and excavate that area, and you would want to be, you know, as gentle as possible. You don't want to use big giant backhoes and, you know, shovels and everything like that. You want to think about this like archaeology when you're doing this, and use a gentle touch. But that is a way that you might be able to locate some headstones. Something that people always ask me about is dowsing, and I do not think that dowsing is a reliable method for locating headstones and burials. Some people swear by it, but it's not one that we recommend. So after we've got our survey and we kind of know what conditions we have in our area, we need to formulate a maintenance plan. And this is particularly important if you have a cemetery that doesn't already have good maintenance, or you might want to review the maintenance plan for an area or a cemetery if you do have maintenance ongoing. Some places have maintenance ongoing and they don't really have a maintenance plan. So you might see some things going on in the cemetery that are really great, and you might see some things that are a little disturbing. And so when you're in the cemetery, you want to always use a push mower when you have an area with lots of headstones. You do not want to use a riding lawnmower like you see in the bottom left. You don't want to use a lawnmower attached to a larger vehicle. What happens a lot of times when you use these larger vehicles, like the one on the left, is the mower will bump into headstones and knock them over, and then they potentially break. And also, and if they don't break, they at least need to be reset. So they cause a lot of issues that way. So I always recommend push mowers with bumpers on them, and you can use a weed whacker or some sort like that, but you want to make sure that you have the appropriately rated string in there, so that if you do end up accidentally hitting a headstone, the string breaks instead of the stone breaking. Another thing that you want to look at out for is, are you creating a condition where moisture can encourage the growth of other, you know, lichens and things on there, like the example in the top left. On the bottom right there, you have a situation where ivy is growing up onto headstones, and you want to make sure you get that off. Now, when you do that, you don't want to go out there and just start yanking stuff off willy-nilly, because that can create an issue where if you apply too much pressure on a headstone that isn't well set, it could crack, it could fall over. Another reason for that, not wanting to pull that straight off, is because there are little tiny roots from the ivy into the stone, and if you just start pulling it, it could cause further cracks in the surface of the stone and you could lose information. So you want to make sure that you approach this by trimming off at the big roots down at the bottom, letting that die back, and then removing those growths after they aren't as filled with water and live, so after they've dried and withered a bit. So what do you want to do after you kind of know about what maintenance is happening? You've got an idea of what resources you have. You want to make sure that your maintenance is creating a safe conditions. So you don't want anybody going into your cemetery and having, you know, any issues because there's tripping hazards or branches or things like that. Something in Missouri that might be a little bit different, or some people may not know, is that if you have personal property and have a cemetery on it, you are required by law to allow access to that cemetery by the public. So you don't have to have open access, but you do have to allow them access if you're contacted. So if you have a cemetery on your property and somebody would like to access it, they can get in touch with you and arrange a time in which to go see the cemetery. So you want to make sure that it is upkept a little bit, so that you don't have any tripping or hazards or anything that somebody might get hurt when they're visiting your cemetery on your property. So if you do have any areas like that, you'll want to clean them up. And then if you have some that maybe you can't get to right now, you might have to wait until you have time or money. So you want to visually identify any hazards that might be there. You know, are there any roots sticking up out of the ground? Is there, any broken headstones that you don't have, that you have there somebody might trip over? You want to identify all of that and make it clear so that people can see where they are and what hazards are presenting themselves. So our next type of plan that we want to talk about is a conservation plan. And this is really where you start to figure out how you are going to address the issues that you have in your cemetery. This is something that while you may not have for every cemetery, it is really helpful. And I forgot to mention earlier when we were talking about surveying, some of these planning tools and surveying may be eligible for grants, but I'd recommend that you talk to Allison from our office, and Kelsey can always put you in touch with her if you don't have her contact information, and she can let you know a little bit more about what activities might be grant eligible activities. So conservation plan, conservation is the act of preserving, guarding, or protecting something, and the plan is what outlines the steps of how you're going to do that. So a lot of people are like, well, preservation, conservation, they use that word interchangeably. However, preservation is the act of trying to stop any conditions from being present that could lead to deterioration and damage, where conservation is what happens when you react to damage that's already happened. So preservation, you're stopping damage from happening before it happens. Conservation, you're reacting to the loss of some damage. So one thing that people often don't realize is that cleaning is not necessarily always a good idea in the cemetery, and that the act of cleaning can cause damage. So the first principle of conservation is do no harm. So if you're not appropriately trained in something, you're not sure about something, don't do it. Just wait and ask for help, find out, get training, and then you'll be able to find out more before you move forward. So what are the conservation principles? Like we said, do no harm. You want to field test all your treatments. You want to document the conditions before, during, and after. You want to use gentlest treatment possible, and make sure that any new fabric is sacrificial to the original fabric. And we're going to go through these here in just a minute. I would like to point out while we're on this slide, I love this picture of people cleaning a headstone, but anytime you are cleaning stone, you should always work from the bottom and go to the top. That is because the cleaner can streak down the sides and actually you'll get an area that's cleaned more and an area that's cleaned less and lead to an uneven clean. So always wash from the bottom to the top and keep everything wet the whole time you're working on it. So the next principle that we're going to talk about is field testing treatments. And it's really important that you field test treatments, because what happens in, what grows in one area doesn't necessarily grow in another area. You also might have stones that are slightly different in each area and their composition. So you want to make sure that you field test your treatments before you just go implementing them cemetery-wide. The only cleaner that we recommend is the cleaner that the National Park Service recommends, because they have done extensive testing on it all over the nation, and that is D2, the letter D, number 2. So anything else, you'll need to make sure that you do tests. So how do you field test a treatment? When you do your field tests, you want to set up a mock-up panel, like you can see here. The panel that you do not want to do like the image in the middle, where they've done their mock-up right on the front of the stone in where all the information is. You want to make sure that you put your panel in an area that everywhere has the same amount and the same type of growth, dirt, soiling, so that you are getting the same type of results, the same type of test in each of the areas. So you'll want to put that panel in an inconspicuous area on a marker, and you want to put it where you have all the issues present. When you do this, you want to record what you've tried where, what that was, when you put it on, all of those good things, how long you let it rest, and then when you cleaned it off. And you always want to do a plain water cleaning, so that you have a control, like any science experiment. So when you're doing cleaning, there's a lot of things that you can do that might seem like they're a good idea at the time, but may cause damage or issues later, sometimes that are immediately visible and sometimes that you see as time goes by. One of those is using a pressure washer on stone. Even at a very low pressure, it's not recommended that you use a pressure washer on headstones, because you will be pushing water into the surface of the stone, which then makes a nice little drink for any sort of growth that might want to grow on there. And so you might look really good on the headstone for about 6 months, and then the next time it gets warm, you've got a whole explosion of growth on there, and then you might also have an uneven finish, like you can see here. So you've got both growth and an uneven finish there because of pressure wash. Using chemicals that are too harsh, like bleach and pool cleaner, you would not believe how many people think that pool cleaner is a good idea on headstones. The way that you might know if a stone has had a chemical on it that was way too strong is it looks kind of like it's melted, like the example here, like you can't really see what it says. It's, all indifferent, you don't know, and if you were to touch this, it would feel all grainy, and that's because little pieces of the stone are actually coming off because the chemical has been too harsh and is breaking down the stone. So just because you wash something off doesn't mean it's gone. So it might leave a residue there and continue to work after, even after you're done your cleaning. I forgot to mention that powdering is called sugaring. And so that's, might refer to that later. And another thing that people do that I've never heard of used as a cleaner for anything else, but shaving cream, apparently it cleans stone really great, but it leaves behind a lot of deposits, which are very, I guess, tasty for plants and encourages their growth. And so after you've cleaned with shaving cream, you often see an explosion of growths on marker. You always want to use the gentlest thing possible. The worst thing you can do is use the most stringent treatment possible, and then when you could be doing a lot less invasive method. Here's somebody else pressure washing, and so you can't tell me that even if you had that on a low pressure, you know, if he's that close to the headstone, it isn't going to cause, you know, some sort of issues. So it's really just best to keep pressure washers out of the cemetery. This is somebody using a Nylox brush on, you know, like a drill, and this will actually take 1/100th of an inch of the stone off whenever you use a Nylox brush. And so not only does it remove the growths and make it look really pretty, it removes the finish of the stone, so then it's more liable to get water infiltration and have growths in the future. So you really don't want to do that. Something that people do in the cemetery, which always makes me sad, is if you have a headstone, it's fallen over, and it maybe has an uneven break at the bottom, instead of resetting that stone appropriately, and if you have questions about how to reset a stone, I can send you just some resources. Instead of resetting it appropriately, they just chop off the bottom of the stone until it's flat and then make a new base. So you're losing information when you do that a lot of times. So a good rule of thumb with cemeteries, if it has a motor on it, it probably doesn't belong in your cemetery or your conservation plan. It can be in your maintenance plan with your lawnmower, but that's different. So how do you prioritize where you're going to send your resources? Because you know, we often don't have a lot of resources for cemetery conservation, and it can be quite a daunting task. So the first thing you want to do is identify your hazardous and unstable conditions. Hazardous conditions are when there is something that will imminently cause damage to a person or property, or loss of information, like the example on the left and this one. So those are both hazardous and need to be addressed immediately if you have any issues like that in your cemetery. Unstable conditions are ones like the one on the right, where if you don't see to them soon, you're probably going to lose information, but they might be stable for a little while, long enough at least for you to take care of your hazardous conditions and then see to your unstable conditions. There's another situation. Ongoing deterioration is when you have some things that you're like, hey, sometime in the future, I probably need to do something about this, but right now it's not a big deal. You will classify markers that way, and you can kind of set up a plan, be like, I'm going to go back and look at these, you know, every 2 years, every 5 years. I'm going to look at it and just make sure that everything's in good condition and see if any intervention needs to take place. Then you have situations where you have irreparable damage and there's just nothing you can really do about it. The example on the left here is one that you often see. Somebody puts a tree next to their family member's headstone, not thinking about how big the tree is going to get if allowed to grow over time, and then the headstone gets engulfed in the tree. And this is the kind of thing where you just want to note that there's a headstone in there. So when the tree does eventually have to be removed or falls, you can remove that headstone from the tree. This situation on the right is where the headstone is close to a roadway, and salts from the roadway are flying in the air and depositing on the stone, and then, you know, as time goes on, it starts to eat away at the stone. What you may not know is that the salt from the road can fly in the air 100 yards. So, you know, if you're anywhere near a roadway, it's probably depositing on, you know, salts on your stone. What are some issues that you might be able to tackle yourself? You know, it's not uncommon to have markers that are starting to get buried. It's absolutely okay for you as an untrained individual to, you know, clean that up and make it more visible so that it doesn't get lost. If you have a situation like this where the cemetery is overgrown, you can definitely go out there and remove those large bushes and trees so that you can actually see that there is a cemetery there. This is great work. And this is kind of the most of, besides mowing the lawn, what you need to do in the cemetery is just kind of keeping things visible. If you have a situation where a stone might be on a flat base, but slightly off, it's absolutely okay to just nudge it back on there. However, if you have a situation like this where the base is off, the stone is off, everything, you know, is in danger of falling down, you definitely want to call a professional and get assistance with that. What are some of the threats that we see in the cemetery? The number one threat are human threats. And so that's often through vandalism, because people don't appreciate or understand the significance of a cemetery. You might also have damage from the wrong types of tools being used. Here's a situation where like a weed whacker was used and the string wasn't the appropriate weight. You have atmospheric threats, you know, like we discussed earlier about how to remove those growths on the image on the left. On the right, we have a situation where you want to remove those growths, you know, off of that box tomb that you have in the rear of the photo, because if you don't, you're going to end up with the situation that you have on the front of the photo. So just, you know, taking care of these simple things is something that, and you know, a person with interest but no specific knowledge can do pretty easy. What are some other atmospheric threats that you might see? Like we talked about before, salt, different chemicals in the air can cause issues, acid rain, you know, just water infiltration. I like to point out that the one on the right was actually a building column, and that was like at the sidewalk where they used a lot of salt. So when they went to remove the pillar, it was just, you know, completely deteriorated, and that's just salt. Salt does that. So make sure any fabric that you use is sacrificial to the original fabric. So you don't want to use anything in a repair that's stronger than the stone itself. So here, you know, somebody is like, I'm going to cover this headstone up. I'm going to make it all metal. It's never going to break again. And they put it right up to the ground. The metal goes right to the ground, and then it breaks off in a new spot further down in the ground. You know, or, you know, we have an example on the right there where somebody has drilled through the headstones. They've caused further damage to the headstone, and they've made the old joint super strong so that it's now broken in a new spot. And so we definitely don't want to do that. A few do's and don'ts for the cemetery. Do make a record of all the resources, document existing conditions, develop maintenance and conservation plans, trim trees, shrubs, and vines, encourage visitors and interpretive activities in the cemetery, use the gentlest means possible, and perform test patches. You do not want to pull vines from markers, take rubbings, do anything that will damage the original surface of the stone, use chemical cleaners or pesticides, herbicides around monuments, or scrape, clean, or repair markers without monuments conservation training. The best way to preserve a cemetery and deter vandalism is to make a cemetery feel safe and inviting by cleaning up debris and maintaining the vegetation. Just also remember that anybody who damages a headstone or moves a headstone is a Class A misdemeanor in the state of Missouri. If you have any questions, I am available via email or phone, and that's my contact info. So I will see. How do I, oh yeah, up here. I'm going to stop sharing and